The camera travels up a long canvas duster, stained with sweat and the dirt of the road. Under the wide brim of a battered Stetson, we see only the lower half of a face, gray bristle, a hard jawline locked in perpetual tension. He doesn't blink against the harsh sun. Notice his right hand. It hangs loose, relaxed, yet hovering mere fractions of an inch from the walnut grip of a Colt revolver. The leather holster is worn smooth-shaped perfectly to the weapon. This is a man who sleeps with his hand on iron. He stops at the edge of the thoroughfare. A crowd has gathered in front of the local saloon. The camera pans across their faces. Men with hollow cheeks and dead sunken eyes. Prospectors, drifters, scavengers, and human skin. They emit a sour stench of stale whiskey, unwashed bodies, and desperation. They are looking up at a makeshift auction block, two empty whiskey barrels supporting a splintered wooden door. On this platform stands a man in a filthy bowler hat, a stained waistcoat stretched tight over a swollen belly. He is yelling, his face flushed purple, dark tobacco juice staining his bottom lip. But the camera ignores him. It focuses on the figure kneeling beside his scuffed boots. A woman. Her wrists are lashed tightly together behind her back with coarse hemp rope. The rough fibers bite deeply into her pale skin, leaving raw red welts. But the most jarring detail is the heavy burlap sack pulled down over her head and secured with a knot at her throat. She is completely blind, suffocating in the stagnant oven-like heat. We see the rapid shallow rise and fall of her chest. The fabric of her torn, faded cotton dress clings to her thin frame, soaked in sweat. She makes no sound, no pleas for mercy, just the silent physical manifestation of sheer endurance. The auctioneer kicks the back of her legs, a blunt, careless motion. He hauls her to her feet by the rope binding her wrists. She sways disoriented, struggling to find her balance on the uneven boards. The crowd snickers, a sound devoid of pity. A few toss copper pennies onto the platform. Bidding. The price of a human life in this godforsaken dust bowl is measured in pocket change. The camera cuts back to the stranger in the duster. His jaw muscles flex. Just once, a microscopic shift in demeanor. Watch his hand. The fingers curl slightly inward. He steps off the wooden boardwalk. His boots crunch onto the hard-packed dirt of the street. The sound is distinct, cutting cleanly through the babble of the crowd. Men turn. The air shifts. The crowd parts instinctively like stagnant water flowing around a jagged rock. They don't know his name, but they recognize the posture. They recognize the quiet, heavy stillness that precedes a killing. The stranger walks slowly down the center of the parted sea of men. The auctioneer's voice falters. The bluster drains from his face as the long shadow of the tall stranger falls over the wooden platform. The silence becomes absolute. You can hear the buzz of a single horsefly, the creak of the wood as the captive woman shifts her weight, her breathing hitching in her throat. The stranger stops at the base of the platform. He does not look at the auctioneer. His gaze is fixed entirely on the burlap sack covering the woman's head. He reaches deep into the pocket of his duster. The movement is smooth, slow, devoid of immediate threat, yet every man in the crowd holds his breath. He pulls his hand out. A single silver dollar rests on his scarred, calloused palm. The metal is tarnished, scuffed from years of changing hands, carrying its own invisible history of blood and cheap commerce. He snaps his thumb upward. The coin flips into the air. The camera tracks its trajectory. It catches a brief, sharp glint of the noon sun before falling. It lands on the splintered wood of the makeshift stage with a heavy metallic clack. $1. The stranger doesn't speak a single word. He doesn't negotiate. He steps onto the first rung of a barrel, reaches up, and takes the end of the hemp rope from the auctioneer's suddenly limp grip. The fat man swallows hard, taking a half step back, his eyes darting down to the stranger's holstered revolver. The stranger gives the rope a gentle, steady pull, a silent command, not a yank. The hooded woman hesitates for a fraction of a second, her bound hands twitching. Then, guided by the tension on the line, she steps forward. Her worn leather shoe finds the edge of the platform. She steps down into the dust. She stands beside him, the towering, weathered figure in the coat and the small captive woman in the hood. He doesn't look back at the crowd. He turns, pivoting on the heel of his boot, and begins to walk toward the edge of town, leading her out of the suffocating circle of men. The silver dollar remains on the wooden boards, gleaming dully in the dirt. No one moves to claim it. The film leaves the decaying town behind, slowly swallowed by the heat haze as the two figures walk out into the vast, unforgiving emptiness of the open desert. The town recedes into a shimmering mirage of heat and dust. The camera pulls back, framing a landscape that holds no mercy. This is a land of bleached bones and jagged rock baked by a sun that feels less like a star and more like a predator. We see them walking. The man leads a roan gelding by the reins, his other hand loosely gripping the end of the hemp rope. The hooded woman stumbles in his wake. Notice the rhythm of their movement. His boots strike the cracked earth with steady, relentless precision. Crunch, pause, crunch. The jingle of his spurs provides a metallic metronome to the agonizing march. Behind him, her steps are erratic shuffling. Her worn leather shoes drag through the loose gravel. The burlap sack over her head denies her the horizon, leaving her trapped in a claustrophobic world of suffocating darkness and the abrasive sound of her own ragged breathing. The air ripples with thermal distortion. It turns the jagged silhouettes of the distant mesas into liquid shapes. The camera lingers on the back of the man's duster. Salt stains map the contours of his shoulder blades. He moves like a ghost haunting the daylight. He does not speak. He does not offer comfort. He merely sets the pace. Watch the woman's shoulders. They are drawn up, tight muscles bunched into hard knots. Every time her foot catches on a buried root or a loose stone, her entire frame jolts. She expects a violent reprimand. The tension radiates from her in waves. A stone shifts under her sole. She trips, pitching forward. Her knees strike the unyielding ground with a dull thud. The rope goes taut. The man stops. He does not yank the line. He does not curse. The camera focuses on his profile. The line of his jaw is granite. He simply stands still, anchoring the rope, waiting. On the ground, the woman freezes. We see the rapid rise and fall of her ribs beneath the thin cotton dress. Her bound hands twitch behind her back, fingers curling into dirt-stained palms. She braces for the impact of a boot, the sting of a leather strap. Seconds stretch. The silence rings in her ears, heavier than the buzzing heat. When the blow does not come, she slowly, painfully pushes herself back up to her feet. She sways, finding her center of gravity. The man turns his head forward. He resumes walking. But notice the subtle shift. His stride is shorter, the pace fractionally slower. A microscopic adjustment. It is not an act of kindness, but of cold, practical mathematics. A broken captive slows him down. A dead one serves no purpose. The sun climbs to its zenith. The desert floor becomes an anvil. The man halts the horse near the dry skeletal remains of a mesquite tree. The shade it offers is an illusion, just a crosshatch of thin gray lines on the blinding white dirt. He loops the reins over a dead branch. He turns toward the woman. He reaches to his saddle horn and unhooks a canvas-wrapped canteen. The water sloshes inside. It is the loudest sound in the world. The woman's head snaps up at the noise. Even through the burlap, her desperation is a physical force. The man steps into her personal space. She instinctively shrinks back, her shoulders hitting the flank of the horse. The animal shifts its weight, snorting. He uncorks the canteen. He lifts it. The camera tracks his calloused fingers as they guide the tin rim of the spout to the rough fabric where her mouth is hidden. He tilts the vessel. Water darkens the burlap. She gasps, drinking greedily through the cloth. Drops spill down her neck, tracing clear lines through the dust, coating her collarbone. She swallows with dry, clicking sounds. He pulls the canteen away before she can gorge herself and vomit. She chases the retreating spout, a pathetic, animalistic lurch forward. He caps the tin. He watches her. The camera pushes in on his eyes, shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. Pale, flat blue. The eyes of a man who has seen the worst of the world and contributed to it. He studies her posture. He reads the raw, bloody chafing around her wrists, where the rough hemp bites into her flesh. He sees the fine tremors shaking her legs. He catalogs the damage. He knows the geography of fear. He recognizes the specific hypervigilant terror of a creature that has been hunted, traded, and beaten into submission. She expects pain as a natural consequence of existence. He reaches a hand toward her face. She flinches violently, a sharp intake of breath hissing through the wet burlap. His hand stops midair. He doesn't touch the sack. He doesn't pull it off. He lets his arm drop back to his side. To remove the hood is to acknowledge her humanity. To unbind her wrists is to invite unpredictability. Out here in the vast killing emptiness, vulnerability is a fatal flaw. He cannot afford the luxury of empathy. Not yet. He turns away, scanning the horizon. The camera sweeps across the barren landscape from his point of view. Miles of scrub brush, shimmering rock, and featureless blue sky. Empty. But he knows the truth of the frontier. Emptiness is a lie. The desert hides its teeth until it is ready to bite. He takes the lead rope. The rough fibers scrape against his leather glove, a steady pull, just enough to communicate intent. They begin to walk again. The sun begins its slow descent, stretching their shadows long and thin across the desert floor, two dark lines trailing behind them like spilled ink. The wind picks up, whispering through the dry thorns. It carries no relief, only the promise of a freezing night to replace the boiling day. The silence between them solidifies, becoming a third presence on the trail. It is a heavy, pregnant quiet, the calm before the inevitable storm. The man walks into the failing light, a phantom leading a prisoner toward a destination known only to the vultures circling high above in the thermal currents. The film cuts. The blinding bleached white of the afternoon gives way to a bruised, violent purple. The sun sinks below the jagged rim of the canyon, pulling the heat down with it into the earth. The camera captures the immediate brutal shift in the atmosphere. You can almost feel the chill bleeding through the screen. The air, previously thick and suffocating, turns brittle. It bites at exposed skin. We see the breath of the roan gelding pluming in the fading light, thick white vapor dissolving into the encroaching dusk. The desert does not slowly cool down. It freezes with the suddenness of a snapped neck. The man leads them down a steep incline into a dry riverbed, a serpentine scar cut deep into the stone by ancient forgotten floods. The high eroded banks offer concealment from the flatlands above, tactical ground. He stops. He drops the leather reins. He does not tie the horse. A well-trained mount stays ground-tied, reserving its energy. Notice the absolute economy of his movements. No wasted steps. He gathers brittle sagebrush and the pale, twisted roots of dead mesquite. He uses the heavy heel of his boot to gouge a narrow, deep trench into the loose sand, an Apache fire hole. It is designed to focus the heat upward and hide the telltale glow from distant, searching eyes. He strikes a sulfur match against the rough, dusty denim of his thigh. The flame flares, a tiny, fragile spark of life against the massive, crushing weight of the darkening sky. He feeds it carefully. The fire catches, emitting a thin, horizontal wisp of pungent, aromatic smoke that clings to the ground. The camera pans slowly across the arroyo to the captive woman. She has collapsed against the steep dirt bank, her legs buckling beneath her. The sudden drop in temperature is tearing through her thin, sweat-dampened cotton dress. Her shoulders shake with violent, uncontrollable tremors. The heavy burlap sack over her head bobs rhythmically with every ragged, freezing breath she takes. The rough hemp rope binding her wrists behind her back scrapes against the abrasive dirt wall as she shivers. She is a portrait of absolute, miserable endurance. The man watches her over the small, flickering flame. The orange light dances across the harsh, deep-set lines of his face, revealing nothing but a calculating emptiness. He studies her. He notes the blue tint creeping into the visible skin of her collarbone. He walks over to the saddle resting on the earth. He unstraps a heavy woven Navajo wool blanket stiff with ingrained dirt and old horse sweat. He steps toward her. She hears the crunch of his boots. She instinctively shrinks back, pulling her bound knees tight to her chest, her entire frame going rigid as she braces for a physical blow. He throws the blanket. It lands heavily, draping over her head and shoulders. She gasps a sharp, choked sound, filtering through the burlap and the thick wool. For a long, agonizing moment, she remains perfectly still, terrified that moving will invite punishment. Then slowly, raw biological instinct overrides her cultivated fear. She huddles deep beneath the heavy wool, burying her face toward her knees, desperately seeking to trap her own fading body heat. He watches her accept the primitive shelter. He turns away without uttering a single syllable. The night settles in entirely. A canopy of crushed diamond stars stretches over the open grave of the arroyo, vast and indifferent. The wind hisses through the dry brush clinging to the canyon rim. The man sits cross-legged near the fire trench. The camera pushes in close on his hands. They are heavily scarred, the knuckles thick and uneven, the skin ingrained with permanent dark grit. He draws his Colt revolver from its leather holster. The oiled metal catches the dim firelight. He breaks open the loading gate. We hear the precise, heavy mechanical click-clack of the steel cylinder turning. He ejects the brass cartridges one by one into his palm. They land with a dull, heavy clink. He inspects each round. He wipes the cylinder with a greasy rag pulled from his duster. This is not mere maintenance. This is a sacrament. A solitary man communing with the only instrument of salvation he still trusts. He reloads. He carefully lowers the hammer so it rests over an empty chamber. An old, ingrained habit of the frontier. The sign of a man who intends to ride hard and live through the night without shooting his own leg off. He slides the heavy iron back into the leather. Next, he pulls a Winchester 1873 lever-action rifle from its saddle scabbard. He runs his thumb along the brass receiver. He checks the loading gate, feeling the tension of the spring. The camera lingers on the cold, flat reflection of his eyes in the polished steel of the barrel. He lays the rifle across his knees. He pulls the wide brim of his Stetson down low, completely obscuring his eyes in shadow. He crosses his arms. To a casual observer, he is asleep, an exhausted traveler succumbing to the fatigue of the trail. But watch his posture closely. The spine is perfectly straight, braced against a rock. The muscles in his jaw are locked tight. The illusion of repose hides a tightly coiled spring. The fire burns down to a shallow bed of glowing red embers, casting long, distorted demonic shadows against the canyon walls. The silence of the desert night is profound, ringing in the ears, then a fracture in the quiet. It is not a loud noise. It is the sudden absence of a natural sound. A distant coyote yipping at the moon miles away cuts off its howl mid-note. It is abruptly, unnaturally silenced. The camera focuses on the side of the man's head. He doesn't shift his body. He doesn't tilt his hat up. But the thumb of his right hand, resting casually near his waist, slowly and deliberately slips over the textured hammer of the revolver. Another sound follows. A metallic clink, infinitesimally faint, carried down the canyon walls by a shifting current of cold air. The distinct, unmistakable sound of an iron horseshoe striking flint rock. The man opens his eyes beneath the shadow of his hat. The pale blue irises reflect the dying red embers of the fire. The weariness we saw earlier is entirely gone. The exhaustion is erased, replaced by a terrifying clarity. The face we see now is angular, cold, and utterly devoid of mercy. It is the face of an apex predator recognizing the scent of approaching violence. Men are coming, men who hunt in the dark. He reaches out with his boot and smoothly, silently kicks a mound of loose dirt over the fire trench. The glowing embers are smothered instantly. Absolute suffocating darkness swallows the screen. We hear only the soft, deadly rustle of his canvas duster as he rises to his feet. He steps away from the camp, melting seamlessly into the blackness of the arroyo walls. The hunter has become the shadow. The screen is pitch black, a heavy, suffocating canvas of night. Slowly our eyes adjust to the faint, icy wash of starlight spilling over the jagged rim of the arroyo. The silence is no longer empty. It hums with lethal intent. We hear the subtle, almost imperceptible slide of gravel, a lone pebble tumbling down the steep earthen embankment. It strikes the hard-packed floor below with a dry, singular click. 3 figures detach themselves from the deep shadows of the canyon rim. They move with the predatory practiced crouch of men who make their living hunting human flesh for coin. The camera catches the dull gleam of a long-barreled shotgun, the worn brass receiver of a repeating rifle. They communicate in sharp, jerky hand signals, slashing the air. They spread out, descending the slope, their boots digging into the loose shale. They are closing a net around the smothered fire pit, confident in their absolute advantage. Cut to the woman. She is a rigid mass beneath the coarse wool blanket. Her breathing stops entirely. She presses her bound wrists hard against her spine, driving her cheek into the freezing dirt. She hears them, the heavy syncopated crunch of multiple boots moving in concert. It lacks the steady, solitary rhythm of the man who bought her. These steps are eager, hungry. She anticipates the rough hands, the dragging, the inevitable return to the auction block. She squeezes her eyes shut beneath the suffocating burlap, bracing for the impact of a rifle butt or a heavy boot. The 3 hunters reach the floor of the dry riverbed. The leader, a massive silhouette smelling of rancid grease and stale sweat, levels his double-barreled shotgun at the lump under the Navajo blanket. He assumes the stranger is asleep, a fool caught off guard in the open. He thumbs back the twin hammers. The metallic double click is deafening in the confined rocky space. He takes a breath to shout a command, to savor the moment of dominance. He never exhales. From the absolute blackness behind him, a shape materializes. It doesn't leap. It flows silent as spilled oil seeping into sand. The stranger does not draw his revolver. Gunfire in the dead of night is a beacon for miles. He opts for the intimate brutality of cold steel. We see the dull flash of a 6-inch blade drawn from a sheath hidden at the small of his back. Notice the terrifying precision. A heavy leather-gloved hand clamps over the leader's mouth, snapping his head violently backward, exposing the thick column of his neck. The blade punches upward, sliding smoothly into the soft tissue just below the jawline. A tight, choked gurgle dies instantly against the leather palm. The stranger twists the handle, severs the artery, and rides the massive body down to the sand, absorbing the dead weight with his own knees. No thud, no alarm. Just the wet, heavy sound of hot blood soaking into the parched, freezing earth. The second man standing 10 yards away registers the subtle shift in the shadows, a displacement of air. He turns, squinting into the gloom, lowering his rifle fractionally. He opens his mouth to whisper a question to his leader, stepping forward. The stranger drops the bloodied knife into the dirt. His right hand drops to his hip. The movement is a blur defying the human eye, a muscle memory carved by years of violent survival. The Colt clears the worn leather holster. Boom! The canyon erupts in blinding golden light. The massive muzzle flash strobes the darkness, freezing the scene in a fraction of a second. We see the second man's face illuminated in harsh yellow eyes, wide jaw slack in the realization of his own death. a halo of vaporizing blood exploding from the bridge of his nose. The thunderclap of the gunshot rolls up the canyon walls, physical and crushing, vibrating in the chest cavity. The third man panics. His discipline shatters. He fires his repeating rifle blind into the blinding afterimage of the flash. Dirt and rock chips kick up near the stranger's boots. The stranger does not flinch. He doesn't seek cover. He steps sideways, a calculated pivot, acquiring his target through the drifting acrid smoke. He thumbs the hammer of the Colt back as the heavy recoil settles into his wrist. Boom! A second flash illuminates the arroyo, casting long demonic shadows against the rock. The third man is slammed backward, his feet leaving the ground as the heavy .45 caliber slug punches cleanly through his sternum. He hits the dirt wall hard and crumples into a heap of tangled limbs and dropping iron. The explosive echoes chase each other down the dry riverbed, fading into a ringing, high-pitched tinnitus. Then the heavy silence of the desert slams back down, thicker and more oppressive than before. The acrid stench of burned black powder mixes with the raw, metallic copper scent of fresh blood. A thick cloud of gray smoke hangs stagnant in the cold air, glowing faintly in the starlight. The camera stays on the stranger. He stands perfectly still. He does not check his own body for wounds. His chest does not heave. He methodically breaks open the loading gate of the revolver and ejects the two spent brass casings. They hit the rocks with a hollow chime. He reaches into his gun belt, extracts two fresh cartridges by touch, and slides them into the cylinder. He clicks the gate shut and holsters the weapon. He walks over to the first man. He retrieves his knife from the sand, wiping the crimson blade clean on the dead man's canvas coat. He moves to the second and third bodies, kicking their dropped weapons out of reach. A cold mechanical verification of death. No anger, no triumph, just the clearing of an obstacle. Under the wool blanket, the woman trembles. The shaking is no longer from the desert chill. It is a primal violent shuddering, originating from her core. She heard the wet tear of flesh, the deafening roar of the iron, the heavy lifeless thud of falling meat. She realizes the grim truth. The man who handed over a single silver dollar for her life is not a simple cowboy. He is not a drifter. He is a butcher. A man who moves through extreme violence with the casual bored grace of a carpenter hammering a nail. The stranger steps back to the smothered fire pit. He reaches down and grips the edge of the Navajo blanket. He pulls it back, exposing her huddled form to the biting air and the starlight. She flinches, curling tighter into a ball, waiting for the searing heat of a gun barrel to press against her temple. He doesn't point the weapon. He stands over her, his broad shoulders blocking out the stars. The sharp scent of cordite and blood clings heavily to his canvas duster. He looks down at the burlap sack covering her face. He speaks for the first time. His voice is a low, abrasive rasp, dry as cracked leather. "Get up!" He turns and walks toward the roan gelding, grabbing the reins. They cannot stay here. The gunfire has announced their position to every scavenger and killer within 10 miles. He leads the horse up the steep embankment, leaving the 3 bleeding corpses to the coyotes. The woman struggles to her feet. Her knees are weak, her breath hitching in her chest. She stumbles blindly after him into the freezing corpse-strewn night, realizing she is tethered to a monster in order to escape the wolves. The sky bleeds from an ink-black canvas into a bruised ashen gray. The horizon cracks open, revealing a thin raw line of pale orange light that offers illumination but zero warmth. The camera pans across a desolate expanse of salt flats, tracking 2 solitary figures, dragging their shadows behind them. The horse's head hangs low, its hooves scraping a hollow rhythm against the crust of the earth. The woman stumbles. She does not fall, but her gait is broken, driven purely by the mechanical momentum of survival. The adrenaline from the night's slaughter has evaporated, leaving only a hollow, crushing exhaustion. Ahead, cutting a jagged silhouette against the lightening sky, sits the skeletal remains of a sodbuster's dream, an abandoned homestead. The roof is completely gone, stripped away by decades of relentless wind. Only 4 crumbling adobe walls and a partial timber frame remain leaning inward like a collapsed lung. The stranger halts the roan gelding in the lee of the highest wall. The wind whistles through the gaps in the mud bricks, a low, mournful sound. He secures the reins to a heavy rusted iron ring bolted to a surviving doorframe. He turns to the woman. She stands rigidly in the center of the ruined room, a captive artifact in a forgotten tomb. The heavy burlap sack over her head is coated in a thick layer of pale alkali dust. She shivers, her shoulders drawn tight against the morning chill. The camera pushes in on the stranger. He studies her. He knows they cannot keep moving like this. A blind-bound captive is a liability in a firefight. The desert demands efficiency, and she is currently a hindrance. Watch the way he moves. Deliberate. He unbuttons his heavy canvas duster, letting it fall open to reveal the worn leather of his gun belt. He reaches to the small of his back and draws the same 6-inch hunting knife he used to open a man's throat hours earlier. The steel catches the dull flat light of the morning. He steps toward her. His boots crunch on the broken floorboards and dried mud. She hears the approach. She hears the distinct metallic slide of the blade clearing the leather sheath. Her entire body seizes. Her breath snags in her throat, a sharp, ragged sound echoing beneath the burlap. She presses her back hard against the crumbling adobe wall, her bound wrists scraping against the rough dirt. She expects the cold bite of the steel. She prepares for the end. The stranger stops inches from her. He doesn't speak. He reaches out with his left hand, grasping her shoulder. The grip is firm, immovable, anchoring her to the spot. With his right hand, he brings the heavy blade up. Notice the surgical precision. He slides the flat of the cold steel between her back and the thick hemp rope binding her wrists. He angles the edge outward away from her flesh. With one sharp downward jerk, the rope snaps. The tension releases instantly. Her arms drop to her sides like dead weights. The joints pop stiff and swollen from hours of restricted blood flow. She groans a low involuntary vocalization of pure agony as circulation violently returns to her hands. She rubs her raw, bleeding wrists against her thighs, still anticipating a trick, a sudden blow. The stranger does not step back. He raises the knife again. He brings it to her throat. She freezes, her lungs locked. He slips the tip of the blade under the thick knot of the burlap sack resting against her collarbone. A flick of his wrist severs the cord. He reaches up, grabs the coarse fabric, and pulls it straight up and off her head. The camera lingers on her face as the oppressive darkness is finally ripped away. She squeezes her eyes shut against the harsh, stinging bite of the morning sun. Her chest heaves as she drags in her first breath of unfiltered air in days. We see the landscape of her suffering. Her hair is a matted, tangled nest of dark brown caked with sweat and trail dust. Her lips are split and blistered, crusted with dried blood. Deep purple shadows bruise the delicate skin beneath her eyes. But the camera focuses on the side of her neck, just below her left ear. There, burned into the pale skin, is a jagged raised scar. It is not an injury from a blade or a bullet. It is a brand. The crude, scorched outline of a broken circle with a line driven through it. A cattle brand. The undeniable physical proof that she was not considered a human being, but livestock. Property to be marked, bought, and slaughtered. The stranger stares at the scar. The camera captures his micro-expression. The hard granite lines of his jaw do not soften, but his eyes narrow fractionally. The flat dead blue of his irises shifts. He recognizes the mark. He recognizes the specific institutional cruelty it represents. It is a language of violence he understands all too well. The woman slowly opens her eyes. They are a piercing, startling hazel bloodshot, and ringed with exhaustion. She squints, her vision blurring as she finally looks at the man who purchased her. She sees the gray bristle on his jaw, the deep weathering lines carved into his face by wind and time, the cold iron resting on his hip. She sees a killer, but she also sees the canteen he is holding. He had unhooked it from his saddle while she was blind. He holds it out to her. He doesn't push it into her chest. He merely offers it, holding it steady in the space between them. A silent peace offering. She stares at the canteen, then up at his face. Her hands tremble violently as she reaches out. Her fingers brush against his worn leather glove. She grasps the tin vessel, pulling it to her chest, as if expecting him to snatch it back. He lets go. As she tilts her head back to drink, the loose sleeve of her torn dress slips down. A small, crumpled object falls from the fabric, landing silently in the dust at the stranger's boots. He looks down. It is a faded sepia-toned tintype photograph, no bigger than a matchbook. It is bent and water-damaged. He bends down, his knees popping in the quiet ruin, and picks it up. He wipes a layer of dirt from the image with his thumb. We see it clearly. A young girl, maybe 5 years old, wearing a clean-pressed dress, standing stiffly for a studio portrait. The woman stops drinking. She gasps, lunging forward, her hand outstretched, panic flooding her features. The stranger looks at the photograph, then at the frantic, broken woman before him. He doesn't withhold the image. He gently places the photograph into her trembling palm. He meets her gaze. The silence between them shifts. It is no longer the silence of a captor and his prey. It is the heavy shared quiet of two ghosts haunting the same graveyard. He turns away, walking toward the crumbling doorway to watch the horizon, leaving her to clutch the only piece of her soul she has left. The pale light of dawn burns away, replaced by the punishing glare of a climbing sun. The temporary reprieve of the desert morning evaporates. The camera tilts up toward the sky. The bruised gray washes out into a blinding, featureless white. Heat ripples rise from the salt flats, distorting the horizon into a wavering liquid mirage. Inside the ruined homestead, the air grows stagnant and heavy. The wind shifts, dropping its mournful howl and adopting a low, steady hiss. It carries fine alkaline sand, blowing it through the gaps in the crumbling adobe walls. The dust coats everything. It settles on the man's canvas duster, lines the deep creases of his face, and powders the cracked leather of his boots. He stands perfectly still in the hollow doorway. His eyes are fixed on the southern horizon. We see what he sees. A smudge of ochre dust, thick and violent, rising against the bleached sky. It is moving fast, tearing across the hardpan. Notice his posture. He does not flinch. He does not step back into the shadows. He watches the dust cloud with the cold, calculating gaze of a mathematician solving a fatal equation. He gauges the speed. He estimates the mass. It is not a stray herd of wild mustangs. It is a coordinated column, a posse. He turns away from the blinding light and steps back into the ruined room. The woman sits with her back pressed tight against the thickest section of the mud brick wall. Her fingers clench the faded tintype photograph against her chest. She watches him. She reads the shift in his demeanor. The casual, guarded stillness is gone. It is replaced by a coiled, absolute focus. The man walks past her. He moves to the roan gelding tied to the iron ring. He doesn't check the cinches. He reaches up and unbuckles the heavy leather saddlebags. They hit the dirt floor with a dense, heavy thud. He unloops the canteen and drops it beside the bags. He steps to the horse's flank and brings his flat palm down hard against its hindquarters. The loud smack echoes in the tight space. The gelding snorts, startled, breaking its tether. It bolts through a collapsed section of the rear wall, its hooves kicking up clods of dry earth as it disappears into the endless scrub. The camera pushes in on the woman's face. She understands the brutal, unspoken language of the frontier. A man on foot in this wasteland is a dead man. By driving the horse away, he has severed his only artery of escape. He has anchored himself to this crumbling tomb. He is not leaving her. He is not running. He crouches beside the dropped saddlebags. He unclasps the heavy brass buckles. He pulls out a thick leather bandolier, heavy with tightly packed loops of ammunition. He slings it over his left shoulder diagonally across his chest. The heavy brass cartridges clink together a cold metallic spine, resting against his collarbone. He draws the Winchester 1873 from its scabbard. He sits heavily on a fallen termite-eaten roof beam. Watch his hands. They are steady, methodical. He presses his thumb against the loading gate on the side of the brass receiver. He feeds the heavy lead-nosed .44, 40 cartridges into the tubular magazine. Snick, click, snick, click. The rhythmic mechanical sound fills the silence of the ruin. It is the steady heartbeat of impending violence. He loads the weapon until the spring refuses to yield. He works the lever once, chambering around. The sharp clack of the action is final. He lays the rifle across his knees. He draws the Colt from his hip, checks the cylinder one last time, and rests it on a flat stone beside him. Outside, the hiss of the wind is drowned out by a new sound. A low, continuous rumble vibrating through the earth itself. The rhythmic drumming of heavy hooves hitting sun-baked hardpan. The posse is closing the distance. The man stands. He moves to the western wall. He finds a narrow window frame, the wood rotting away. He uses the heavy brass butt plate of his Winchester to smash out a loose, crumbling adobe brick, widening his field of fire. He stacks 2 flat rocks on the ledge to create a stable rest for the rifle barrel. He checks his angles. He maps the kill zone. The dust cloud washes over the homestead, plunging the ruin into a suffocating yellow twilight. The sand stings the eyes and coats the teeth. Through the swirling grit, silhouettes emerge. The camera captures the riders breaking their tight column. They spread out, forming a wide tactical crescent. 12 men. Men in long, heavy dusters, their faces obscured by bandanas and the brims of low-pulled hats. The heat haze warps their outlines, making them look like demons rising from the cracked earth. They carry repeating rifles and double-barreled shotguns. These are not scavengers. They are the men who own the brand burned into the woman's neck. They have come to reclaim their property and slaughter the thief. The woman crawls across the dirt floor. The rough gravel scrapes her bare knees, but she doesn't feel it. She reaches out her trembling fingers, hovering mere inches from the dusty heel of the man's boot. She expects him to grab her by the hair. She expects him to hurl her out the doorway as a peace offering to the riders, a sacrifice to buy his own life. He looks down at her. His flat blue eyes reveal nothing. He points the heavy barrel of the Winchester toward a sunken depression in the corner of the room, an old root cellar half covered by a thick, heavy slab of timber. He doesn't speak. He just nods toward the hole. She stares at him, her chest heaving, her lungs burning with the alkaline dust. She scrambles backward, sliding into the shallow, dark depression. She pulls a piece of rotted canvas over the opening, burying herself alive in the dirt. The riders halt 50 yards from the perimeter of the ruin. The wind whips their long coats around their legs. The leader sits atop a massive black stallion, a dark blot against the bleached landscape. He raises a gloved hand. The drumming of the hooves stops. The silence that follows is absolute. It is a heavy pressurized vacuum. The air tastes of copper and impending ruin. Inside the crumbling walls, the man steps into the shadows of his firing position. He rests the octagonal barrel of the Winchester between the stacked stones. He settles the walnut stock against his shoulder. He closes his left eye. He thumbs back the hammer. The crisp double click rings out sharp and clear, slicing through the heavy tension like a razor. He waits for the storm to break. The camera frames the leader of the posse through the V-notch sight of the Winchester. He sits tall in the saddle 30 yards out, opening his mouth to issue a command. He never finishes taking the breath. The man inside does not issue a warning. He does not demand surrender. He simply squeezes the trigger. The heavy rifle bucks against his shoulder. The deafening crack shears through the pressurized silence. A bloom of white smoke erupts from the muzzle. The camera cuts to the leader. The heavy .44, 40 slug punches through the center of his chest. The kinetic impact lifts him out of the stirrups, throwing him backward over the rump of his stallion. He hits the hardpan with a dull, heavy thud. For a fraction of a second, the remaining 11 riders freeze their brains, struggling to process the sudden violent decapitation of their unit. Then the desert erupts. A wall of lead tears into the crumbling homestead. The sound design becomes an overwhelming, chaotic roar of gunfire. Repeating rifles and heavy-gauge shotguns unleash hell upon the ruins. The camera tracks the destruction. Bullets chew through the mud bricks, sending blinding geysers of pulverized clay and choking dust into the stagnant air. Splinters of ancient dry wood explode inward like shrapnel. The air grows instantly thick with a sharp sulfurous stench of burning black powder. Notice the man inside. He is a machine operating in a storm of chaos. He does not cower. He fires. He works the lever of the Winchester. The brass linkage clacks open, ejecting a smoking empty cartridge into the air, and chambers a fresh round in one fluid practiced motion. He fires again. A rider on the left flank folds over his saddle horn, his horse bolting in panic. The volume of incoming fire is staggering. A heavy bullet breaches the weakened adobe right beside the man's head. The impact shatters the brick, sending a jagged fist-sized chunk of hard clay slamming into his right temple. The camera shakes, mimicking his concussion. His vision doubles. He staggers back, his boots dragging through the loose dirt. Blood instantly wells from the gash, tracing a bright red line down his dust-caked cheek. He shakes his head, spraying sweat and blood, forcing his eyes to focus through the ringing trauma. The posse realizes they cannot flush him out while mounted. They dismount, taking cover behind scattered rocks and the skeletal remains of a wagon. They begin to advance on foot, leapfrogging toward the perimeter, laying down suppressing fire. The man moves. He is a phantom in the choking, swirling dust of the ruin. He abandons the window, dropping to a low crouch. He pivots to a vertical crack in the eastern wall. He snaps the rifle to his shoulder. 2 rapid shots. Another attacker drops in the sparse scrub, clutching a shattered hip. He checks the magazine. Empty. He drops behind a thick section of the wall. His heavy fingers move with mechanical precision, shoving fresh brass cartridges through the side loading gate. Click, click, click. He doesn't look at the weapon. His flat blue eyes scan the perimeter through the drifting smoke. 3 men rush the collapsed rear wall, utilizing the blind spot. The man hears the crunch of their boots over the ringing in his ears. He spins. He fires from the hip. The first man takes a round to the gut and collapses into the rubble. The second man brings up a double-barreled shotgun. The blast is thunderous. A swarm of heavy lead buckshot tears through the man's long canvas duster. Several pellets chew into the meat of his left shoulder and upper arm. The sheer kinetic force of the blast spins him around like a rag doll. He hits the dirt floor hard, his back slamming against the rotted baseboards. The Winchester clatters out of his grip, sliding across the dusty earth. The attacker steps over the rubble, breaking open his shotgun to reload for the execution. Watch the man on the ground. He does not writhe. He does not scream. His right hand drops to his hip. He draws the heavy Colt revolver from its leather holster. He fires upward from his back. The heavy .45 caliber slug catches the attacker squarely under the jaw, snapping his head back and dropping him instantly into the dust. The man rolls onto his stomach. His left arm is dead weight, hanging limply at his side. Dark, wet blood saturates the canvas of his coat, turning the fabric a deep, slick crimson. He forces himself up. He plants his right boot, using the crumbling adobe wall to brace his weight. His breathing is a wet, ragged rasp, echoing in the brief lull in the gunfire. Underneath the rotted timber slab in the corner, the woman huddles in absolute darkness. Fine dirt rains down on her head with every bullet strike. She hears the heavy thuds of falling bodies. She hears the wet, labored breathing of the monster standing above her, bleeding out to keep her hidden. 5 men left. They coordinate a final breach, rushing the open front doorway simultaneously. They step into the suffocating twilight of the ruined room, their rifles raised, searching through the thick gray smoke. The man waits in the deep shadow of the corner. He cannot use the rifle. He raises the heavy Colt with his right hand. His arm trembles violently from blood loss and shock, but he locks his wrist, anchoring the iron. He thumbs the hammer back. 3 deliberate, deafening roars echo inside the confined space. He does not fan the hammer. He aims. 2 men drop instantly, their chests blown open. The 3rd man takes a round to the shoulder, spinning him backward out the doorway. The last 2 men fire blindly into the shadows. A heavy rifle slug punches cleanly through the meat of the man's right thigh. His leg simply ceases to function. The bone holds, but the muscle turns to fire. He collapses his back, sliding down the rough mud wall until he hits the dirt floor in a seated position. The final attacker sees him fall. The posse member steps forward, racking his repeating rifle, aiming down at the seated, bleeding figure. The man's Colt is empty. He drops the heavy iron. He reaches behind his back with his good right hand. He draws the 6-inch hunting blade. As the attacker steps within striking distance to ensure the kill, the man lunges upward off his good leg. It is a desperate, ugly, primal movement. He drives the steel upward, burying the blade deep into the attacker's groin and twisting violently. The man shrieks, dropping his rifle, his hands flying to the wound. The protagonist rips the blade free and drives it upward again, sinking it into the man's throat. The shrieking stops. The attacker collapses, bleeding out over the protagonist's boots. The gunfight ends. The sudden silence is heavier than the gunfire. It rings in the ears, a high-pitched metallic whine. The thick gray smoke of black powder slowly drifts upward, escaping through the ruined roof, revealing shafts of harsh, blinding sunlight. The dust begins to settle, coating the fresh, bleeding corpses littered across the floorboards. The camera slowly pushes in on the man. He sits against the wall. He is a ruin of a human being. Blood pours from his temple of his shoulder, and his thigh soaking into the dry, thirsty earth beneath him. He lets his head fall back against the adobe bricks. His chest heaves with shallow, wet breaths. He does not check his wounds. He simply stares at the empty doorway, waiting for his heart to finally stop beating. The settling dust catches the harsh, vertical rays of the midday sun, turning the ruined homestead into a cathedral of suspended grit and slaughter. The camera pans slowly across the cracked dirt floor. It does not look away from the carnage. It documents the tangled limbs, the empty brass casings gleaming dully in the dirt, the dark viscous pools of blood soaking into the thirsty earth. The deafening roar of the gunfight is gone. In its place is a silence so profound, it feels heavy, broken only by the low, dry whistle of the wind through the bullet-pocked adobe walls and the sickening wet sound of the man's labored breathing. Notice his posture. He is slumped against the corner, a ruined monument of canvas and torn flesh. His left arm hangs useless, the fabric of his duster, saturated, dripping, a steady rhythmic crimson beat onto the dust. His right leg is stretched out awkwardly, the denim stained dark around the entry wound. He makes no effort to stem the bleeding. His chin rests on his chest. He looks like a man who has finally finished a long, grueling shift of manual labor. He is simply waiting to clock out. A sound breaks the stillness, a dry scraping friction. The heavy timber slab covering the root cellar shifts. The camera focuses on the dark rectangular hole. Pale, trembling fingers grip the rough edge of the floorboards. The woman drags herself upward. She emerges from the earth like a ghost rising from a shallow grave. She is coated head to toe in fine, pale alkali dust, turning her into an ash-white specter. She coughs a dry hacking sound, spitting grit from her cracked lips. She blinks against the stabbing glare of the sun piercing the ruined roof. We see her take in the room. She maps the geography of the dead. She sees the bodies of the posse members, the men who hunted her broken and lifeless. Then her eyes find him. She freezes. She does not run to him. She does not scream. The frontier has burned the hysteria out of her. She steps carefully over a splintered rifle stock. She avoids a widening pool of dark blood. She stops 3 feet from his outstretched boots. He does not move, but his eyelids flutter. He forces them open. The pale blue irises are no longer flat and cold. They are clouded, the sharp focus blurring at the edges as the blood loss drains his core temperature. He looks at her. He sees that she is unmarked. The heavy burlap sack is gone. The ropes are gone. Her tormentors are meat for the buzzards. The transaction is complete. Watch his right hand. the only part of his body that still obeys his command. It slides slowly, agonizingly inside the lapel of his blood-soaked duster. He withdraws a small, heavy leather pouch. He doesn't hold it out. He simply lets it drop from his weakening grip. It hits the dirt with a dense metallic clink. Gold. He swallows, his throat working dryly. When he speaks, his voice is a wet, grinding whisper, barely audible over the wind. There is a bay mare outside, untethered. He stops, dragging oxygen into his failing lungs. Take her. Ride straight north. Keep the sun on your left shoulder in the morning, right in the evening. He coughs, a wet, rattling sound deep in his chest. A thin line of crimson escapes the corner of his mouth, tracking down through the gray bristle of his jaw. 3 days. You hit the rail line. Buy a ticket. Don't look back. The woman stares down at the pouch of gold, then up at his fading face. She kneels. The rough dirt bites into her bare skin. She reaches out. She doesn't reach for the money. Her trembling fingers hover over the ruin of his shoulder, instinctively wanting to apply pressure to bind the wound, to preserve the life of the only creature in this wasteland who stood between her and hell. He shakes his head. It is a microscopic movement, barely a fraction of an inch, but it carries absolute, undeniable finality. He doesn't want salvation. He doesn't want a nurse. Look at his face. The tension that defined his jawline, the hypervigilance that kept his hand hovering over iron, it is melting away. For the first time since the film began, the exhaustion in his eyes looks peaceful. He has carried the weight of his own monstrous past for decades. This bleeding out, this final brutal act of protection for a stranger, is the currency he is using to buy his own way out. He is paying his debt. She understands. The language of the broken does not require translation. She slowly lowers her hand. She picks up the leather pouch, the weight of it heavy and cold in her palm. She looks at him one last time. Her bloodshot hazel eyes lock onto his fading blue ones. A silent exchange of profound, tragic weight. She stands, she turns her back to him. She steps over the dead, walks out the crumbling doorway, and steps into the blinding heat of the afternoon. The camera stays with the man. We hear the crunch of boots on gravel outside. We hear the nervous snort of a horse. Then, the rhythmic receding thud of hooves striking hardpan, growing fainter and fainter, until it is swallowed entirely by the vastness of the desert. He sits alone in the slaughterhouse. The shadows begin to lengthen as the sun starts its slow descent. A single black fly lands on the barrel of his discarded Winchester. He tilts his head back against the mud bricks. He stares up through the collapsed roof at the endless, indifferent expanse of the pale blue sky. He closes his eyes. The wind picks up, howling through the ruins, carrying the dust, erasing the tracks, burying the blood, and finally mercifully returning the frontier to its eternal, silent emptiness. The screen fades to black. The low howl of the desert wind remains. A single silver dollar bought her freedom, but it cost his last drop of blood to secure it. He was no righteous lawman. He was a creature forged in violence, a man who spoke the language of the gun with fluent, terrifying ease. He traded his final breath to erase one ledger of cruelty, choosing to bury his own heavy sins beneath the adobe dust rather than walk away. But ask yourself this. Does a final act of absolute bloody sacrifice truly wash away a lifetime spent riding alongside the devil, or did he simply find a hill worth dying on knowing his soul was already beyond salvage? Drop your verdict down in the comments. Tell me where the line between a butcher and a savior is drawn in the dirt. If the grit of this trail stayed with you, leave a steady like. Subscribe to Iron Resolve Tales. We have more broken frontiers to cross and more quiet legends to unearth. Keep your iron loaded, and I will meet you further down the trail.